Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to everyone.
Morning, Doctor.
Morning, Afi. How are you?
Morning, Doctor. Sorry.
Anim. How are things in Kelantan? Afi?
It's getting worse, I think.
Getting worse. the virus.
Yeah, because yesterday we got 9 cases.
Oh, but you guys have no MCO, right? Not MCO.
Not yet, but still cannot. I mean, merentas daerah boleh, but cannot cross the state.
Oh, okay. Right. Oh yeah, 9 cases, huh? It's going up. Well, inshallah, it won't get any worse. Yeah, Selangor, we hit 230 something yesterday, so it's not good for Selangor. Okay, so how's everyone else? All right. Okay, so we've got 27 people online. So let's get started. We have actually a lot to do today because next week is what? Does everybody know what's next week? If you've seen the schedule for class.
Midterm.
Yes. It's our first exam for the semester. Hey, why you guys all have your screens off? I can't see anybody's faces this morning. Everybody's super shy today. All right. Thank you, Hazi. Okay, Nina. now I've got 2 faces in front of me. Everybody else is offline. Okay. Well, please, I encourage you to turn your screens on. I won't force you, but I encourage you to do so. It's always nice to interact with people you can actually see rather than a screen. Anyway, so yeah, next week we have our first exam. So today what I want to do is I want to first just give you a brief overview of what's going to be on the exam next week. All right, it's not really an exam; it's actually like a quiz. It's a very short exam. All right, today we'll be starting only our 3rd topic actually for the class, so we don't have a whole lot of material to cover anyway. So, so it won't be terribly long. Okay. So, are there any issues or concerns that we need to discuss first? Anyone want to share anything or have any questions? All good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let me just quickly share this. I'm just going to go to Puja Blast first. Okay. All right. So in Puja Blast, this is today's class. You guys still there?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
My
yes.
computer's having some problems. Oh, no.
No, we can see.
You cannot see me? Tak boleh?
Yes.
Can. Now can.
Betul.
But my Zoom is like going crazy. Okay. Can you see Puja Blast on your screens?
Yes.
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 Great, thank you. Okay, so today's agenda. All right, so let's look at exam 1. Okay, so as I just mentioned, so we've only had really, well, today will be our 3rd lecture topic. Okay, so in terms of content, so we only have the introduction, right? Introduction to Youth Development that we discussed earlier, first class. And then we have our, of course, Youth Development theories, both the deficit and positive developmental theories. Okay, so we have 2 sort of topics there. And then today we'll begin talking about youth growth and development. All right. So today I will only include, we may not get through the whole lecture, the whole content, because it's a little bit, well, in terms of time, we just don't know. Okay, so whatever we cover today is the only thing that will be on the exam. So don't worry about covering what's not discussed today. I'll only include on the exam what we cover today in class. So up until that point, okay? So that's in terms of content. So there's not a whole lot of content, but please, prepare also by going back through the reading the chapter on theories that I sent you. Okay, so that's gonna be really important, as well as tomorrow. What I want to do tomorrow in class is I want to use your vignettes that you developed last week. Okay, and I went through them. So some very good ones. And so I want to use those tomorrow to help us better understand the theories and how we apply the theories. Because on the exam, there will probably be a question where you'll have to apply the theories to a scenario. Okay, so some kind of case study, some kind of case or some sort of scenario I'll give you, and then you have to sort of apply the theories. Okay, so we'll work on that a little bit tomorrow in class using your vignettes. All right, and don't be surprised to see the vignettes you created last week, to see them on the exam. Okay, I'm gonna use your own work as part of the exam questions. All right, so that's content. Format, it's just gonna be 15 questions, a combination of multiple choice, some true false, short answer, like you have to provide just 1 or 2 short answers, okay? And then there'll be 1 short essay at the end, which will be 5 points, okay? The total is only 20 points, all right? So each question, the first 15 will be 1 point, and then the short essay will be 5 points, all right? It'll be I'm gonna do it through Google Form, all right? It'll be a Google Form, online, obviously, and open resource. Open resource means, well, in the old days, we would call it open book. Since we don't use books right now too much, we're going to call it open resource. So I cannot obviously really prevent you from using your notes and the internet and so forth. So you can use them, that's fine. The questions will not be coming directly from your notes anyway. Of course, the notes will help you, but I'm not going to be pulling anything directly from your notes. So that'll require you to sort of, understand the material a bit more, a bit deeper, okay? Because you are going to be allowed to use different resources and references. All right, so in terms of restrictions, I will require you tomorrow, next week, to keep your screens on during the exam, okay? And please, no use of hand phones, unless you need the hand phone to have your screen on for me to see you, okay? But, and there's no communication, of course, with other people, right? So even though you can use internet, you can use your notes and stuff, you cannot communicate with others, okay, obviously. So there's no sharing of answers and so forth. All right, so I'll give you 45 minutes, okay, which should be plenty of time because it's not a very long exam. As I mentioned, it's only 20 points, all right? And so, yeah, again, review the material on youth development theories and be prepared to apply the theories in a real life, in real life examples or for real life examples, okay? So I would just emphasize that, right? And then whatever else we've discussed in class. It's important, I think, that you, if you can, to study, go back and listen to the lectures again rather than just looking at the notes, because again, like I said, I'll probably be pulling more things from how I've discussed the topics in class, more so than just the written notes themselves, right? So you need to sort of understand that. Okay, so, and that's pretty much it. So it's all here on Putra Blast. You can go back and read this again later if you want, when you start to study. Okay. Any questions?
No.
Nothing?
No.
All right, it's clear.
Hello, the exam will be in Wednesday or Thursday?
Good question, Hazik. Good question. I think it'll be Wednesday. All right, next week.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, Wednesday next week. Have you guys been, just to make sure you've been doing the attendance every week, right? You've been clicking on the link. Please don't forget to do the attendance, okay? Click on the attendance link. All right, so if there's no questions, you gotta have some questions. Something related to the exam? Can't be that clear. Nothing at all?
I just so this is Hanim.
Hi, Hanim.
Regarding the Vinehead, you said that some of them are going to be in the exam question. Okay, I'm asking you not to put mine. Thank you.
Why? Yours was so good.
No, I don't want to share my story with others.
Okay. All right. I'll be sure not to do that. But of course, they'll be anonymous. No one's going to know who wrote the story. But I will respect your wishes. I will not put yours on.
Thank you so much.
So the way they'll be used is they make good questions for like because you guys all wrote them according to one particular theory. So I can put it on the exam and ask, okay, which theory does this story or this vignette apply to? And then you can, sort of choose in a multiple choice format. All right, so they make good questions like that. Or I could say, based on this vignette, name 2 theories that could apply to this, or something like that. All right, so they make really good questions in that way. All right. Okie doke. All right, so are there any other questions? Anything else? This will be my first time using Google Form for an exam. So I'm hoping there won't be any glitches, but just be prepared for anything. All right. Okay, so with that, I will start on our topic for today. Today's topic, we're now going to move into the attributes of youth, begin to look at the title of this is called Youth Growth and Development, and it refers to, what are these sort of attributes of youth from a physical perspective? So physical growth and change, cognitive growth and change, emotional, spiritual. So like before, when we mentioned that youth is this period of change and transition and moving from childhood to adulthood and all that, it is a period of life, as you all know very well, that you go through a lot of changes, right? Young people go through a lot of changes. And so we want to just sort of have an overview about what some of those changes are, because a lot of people are not that aware of how and what ways young people actually go through all these changes. And sometimes when we witness youth behavior, we think, wow, that's really strange. Like, why are those kids doing that, right? So why do Mutt Rumpet, do the things they do? Why do young people, different types of, different groups of young people, why do they do the things they do? Sometimes these behaviors can be explained just from the perspective of, for example, biological and cognitive growth. Okay, so when they go through a lot of these changes that they're going through, it affects them in different ways. So also, it affects their ways of thinking. It affects their views of the world. It affects how they process information, their ability to make decisions, all that. Okay, so it really is a period where there's a lot of change going on. So let's try and understand what are some of these changes that young people experience as they become adults. Okay, so human development is a process that begins with birth. Okay, from the moment we're born, we are developing. And in fact, even before we're born, when we're in the womb of our mothers, we are developing, right? All right, but then when we're born, we're actually born into the world, we begin this process of growth and development, right? And of course, this ends with death, obviously. All right, and so you can see in the picture there, it's sort of like this arc, right? You come into the world on 4 feet, crawling around on your knees and your hands, and you exit the world. Or for many people that reach old age, they exit the world on 3 legs, right? With the tongkat, in addition to the kaki, right? So you start off with 4, you end up with 3. And in between you're on two legs. Okay. So that's kind of the way the lifespan sort of changes. All right. So there's different, as I mentioned, there's different types of growth and development. Physical changes, as we can see, mental and cognitive changes, emotional changes, social changes, and spiritual changes. All right. So these are the 5 of the major ways that young people grow and develop. And these all affect young people's needs. And from a youth development perspective, that's what we're most concerned with, is what are the needs of young people? Because if we are going to be helping young people as HRD officers or youth workers or teachers or government officers that do programs or plan programs, we need to be able to understand clearly what are the young people's needs so that we can develop programs and so forth that can really help them address those needs. All right, that's what youth development programming is all about. So physical growth, of course, refers to the body. Yeah, so we have bodily growth. All right, so in those ages between, let's say 15 to 30 in Malaysia, in other countries it's a bit earlier, say 10 to 24. Right, so the adolescent, the teenage years, the early adulthood years, okay, but especially the teenage years, especially as teenagers, there's a lot of change in terms of height and weight. Obviously, this is the age where young people grow quite a bit, both vertically as well as horizontally. Yeah. So there's height changes, there's weight changes. The nerves and the muscles begin to develop, right? So you see a lot of teenage boys, they start to get a lot of very big muscles, they start to develop their muscles through sports and so forth. Their bodily organs are changing, right? Hormones are changing. The body is secreting new hormones all the time, right? And the brain begins to develop more. And this is really important, especially for understanding teenage behavior, right? Has to do a lot with brain development, right? The development of the brain. Because the brain is like a big processor. It's like a big computer processor. It's processing information, and it processes information in different ways, right? And so the more it develops, the more dynamic is that processing, right? The more the different ways, more the additional dimensions of how the brain can process information. So speaking of the brain, okay, changing brains mean that adolescents act differently from adults. So we always wonder, why do teenagers do those crazy things that they do? Right? Is it just because they're immature and they're young, right? And they're more like children? Well, yes and no. Part of it has to do with the fact that the brain is changing a lot during adolescence and teenage years, right? And it's actually a very critical time of brain formation during adolescence, all right? Adolescents' brain work very differently than adults when they make decisions or solve problems. Okay, that's really important to take note of. And you can see here down below, it says here the brain areas such as the prefrontal cortex, which subserves higher cognitive functions such as behavioral control, planning, and assessing the risk of decisions, matures later than the cortical areas associated with sensory and motor tasks. Who can interpret that for me? What does that mean? I know it's very sort of complex English. Can anybody interpret what that means? Who'd like to try it? In terms of explaining teenage behavior, can you interpret this?
You mean maybe because the prefrontal cortex is the function is to receive input from multiple regions of the brain because it processes information.
Okay, all right.
And so
And
it's more like for focusing.
okay, all right.
maybe that is why when someone is growing up, they tend to focus on one thing first. You know, when they are in their teenage years, they tend to focus on what they want instead of what they need. So that is why they use the prefrontal cortex more. And as they grow up, they know that uh, they were focusing on the wrong thing. So that is why they mature later than the cortical areas.
Okay. All right. Excellent attempt. Very good, honey. Excellent attempt. Anybody else want to share what you think this means?
Excuse me, Prof. I want to share what my view on this statement.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I can understand for the statement is that, like Hanim said, because the prefrontal cortex like mature later than the cortical areas, that's why as as a child, like in the early stage, we tend to have sensory and motor tasks, like those such as vision, touch, smell is like the example of sensory, right? So
Yeah.
because this part of cortical part mature more than the uh, prefrontal cortex. That's why as a child we tend to follow, like like the things that we said, the children follow what we do, right? Like they always, like if in my family, like my mother didn't allow us to say aku or kau to the children, because
Yeah.
basically they will follow us, because like the statement said that the sensory part mature more than the prefrontal cortex. That's why children didn't think about their future, since the prefrontal cortex mature later than the cortical part. That's what I understand.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mimi. That's excellent. Excellent. Yeah. I think you really nailed it. Hanim, you also very good answer. Yeah, so essentially that's right. The brain does not all develop in a uniform manner. There's certain parts of the brain that develop earlier than other parts. So here what it's saying is that prefrontal cortex, that area of the brain that is responsible for what's called executive functioning, right? So all the very what we call mature attributes of people, right? Being able to control yourself, behavior control, being able to plan for the future, right? Being able to assess risk, right? Looking at a situation and pros and cons, what should I do here? That kind of sort of mature thinking is actually a capacity of the brain. And that capacity does not develop early on in our lives. It takes time for that capacity of our brains to develop, that ability for the brain to do all those things. That's the prefrontal cortex. What develops first is that part, the cortical areas, where that is responsible for the sensory and motor tests, like Mimi just mentioned. All those very, I want this, I want that. I know all the things that associated with the senses. Look at little children; they love to touch everything, right? Again, that's part of that part of the brain, which develops first. It develops earlier, right? So this helps us to really understand young people's behavior in a lot of ways, because we always complain, oh, young people, they don't plan, they can't assess things, they can't think in a higher order manner, and all these complaints that we have. And it's not just a matter that they're immature, right? It's actually about their brain capacity, right? So it helps us to understand why teenagers take so many risks, right? Because again, they're not that part, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet, so they don't really have that. It's not, in other words, it's not that they cannot do it, but it's harder for them. They're not really fully capable of making those types of mature decisions. Now, that's not to say that teenagers should not be responsible for their decisions and so forth. No, not at all. And it doesn't mean they don't have any capacity to do it. They do. And that's why education is so important. Like Mimi, you said, why your parents need to teach you to say the right words and to speak correctly and so forth. Right? They have to learn it, right? And they have to learn. It has to be reinforced, and that's why it has to be repeated so many times by parents, right? I mean, I have a 14-year-old son, and I have to repeat things a million times for him to, finally do something or to get it, to understand it, right? So it's not that they're just being stubborn. There is an element there of that relates to their cognitive development and ability, all right? So that's the point. And it's really important to know that, I think, especially if we work with young people in different capacities, or even as parents, it's important to know that. So their actions at that age, that young age, especially in the teenage years, so they're guided more by their emotions, right? And they're what's called the reactive amygdala, and less by the thoughtful, logical frontal cortex. Okay, so that's why they tend to be very emotional, right? We always complain about, teenagers being very overly emotional, dramatic, right? And this is what a lot of young teenage girls get accused of, being so emotional about stuff. Teenage love, in reality, I mean, let's face it, it's a reality. Young teenagers falling in love and all that. That's also driven in many ways by that reality of the way the brain develops as well. Okay, so that's part of it as well. Okay, so based on that and based on their stage, and this is not a class on neuroscience. We're not going to get into the real details of this, but it's important just to have a basic understanding of it when we talk about youth development, especially adolescents. So because of that, teenagers, adolescents are more likely to act on their impulses. In other words, as soon as they want something, they go for it, right? They don't wait. They don't think. As we say, adults say, these young people, they don't think before they do things. They don't think before they act. They just do it, right? That's partly because of how they're, what stage of their brain development. They are more likely to do that, right? And again, that's why adults have to keep reminding them not to do it. They have to learn not to do it, right? And to think first. And sometimes, you get teenagers that say, I don't know how, what do you think about that? I don't really think anything about it. They don't have any sort of thought on it, because maybe they're just not that, the brain is not matured enough for them to be able to do that really well. Okay, so they like to act on impulse. When they want something, they go for it, right? And this again relates to why young people are always out there marching in the streets, leading social movements, and they're out there, they're fearless, right? They're out there protesting, and they're screaming, and they're yelling, and they're very passionate about what they believe a lot of times, right? And it's acting on impulse. They misread or they misinterpret social cues and emotions. Okay, so we see this all the time in teenage dramas, right? Oh, they're talking about me behind my back, or she's saying that about me, or she's causing fitna, or they get these sort of obsessions with what people are saying about them and thinking about them and all that. Okay, again, that's also related to this stage in cognitive development, all right? And the emotional aspect of our brain development. They get into a lot of accidents, as we know, young people. In Malaysia, it's of course, very sad. We have always hearing about motorbike accidents, car accidents even. This is also because at this age, at this stage in brain development, teenagers take a lot of risks. Yeah, especially, anybody who drives can see the way a lot of motorbikers drive. Okay. And so they tend to get in accidents, obviously, because of that, right? In a lot of cultures, there's a lot of fighting among teenagers. Also related to this, inability to regulate their emotions, inability to control their anger, okay? Being very sensitive to what others say about them, and so forth. And this is also triggered by brain development as well, all right? Because they're more likely to act on their emotions. As soon as they hear somebody saying something, they can't stop to think and say, well, let's see, if I go and fight him, this could happen to me, and I don't really want that to happen to me. I don't want to get in trouble, or I don't want to get thrown in jail, or they don't process that way. They just go. You said, what about me? And they go and they just fight, right? So it's that kind of impulsivity, as we would say. Okay, and they engage in a lot of dangerous and risky behaviors. And again, that's part of, and that comes with the territory. You know, that comes with this kind of stage where they're at, right? So that's why in youth development, we often say it's actually quite normal in some ways for teenagers and young people to engage in those kind of behaviors. Not to say we want them to, not to say we want them to be getting into fights and going 180 kilometers an hour on the highway. And, you know, we don't want them doing these risky things, but it's understandable given their stage of development, where they're at in terms of their brain development and so forth. Okay, so it's really important to know this, that it's not just that, and this is why a lot of adults that don't know these things, they criticize teenagers and adolescents without realizing that there's reasons behind this, right? And these are physiological reasons. This has to do with how our body develops. Okay, any questions so far? Nothing?
Oh.
Okay,
No.
all right. Let's go on. So, based on that, adolescents are less likely to think before they act, less likely to consider the consequences of their actions, as I just mentioned, right? And they're less likely, it's much harder to change these behaviors that they're involved in, because there's such a strong urge, and they don't have that regulatory capacity. They don't have the executive functioning to regulate themselves unless they are helped and trained by adults. So that's why parents play such an important role. Teachers play such an important role in helping teenagers to learn how to think things through, learn how to think about the consequences of their actions, understand when things are dangerous for themselves or others. They have to learn these things, and that's our role as adults, right? So adults have this really important job to play. And so when young people grow up in places, environments, families where they don't have these adults guiding them and helping them to understand the consequences of their actions, it's very difficult, and it creates a situation where you get young people doing excessive types of risky behaviors, right? Okay, so does that mean they cannot make decisions? No, they can. Okay, so you see here effects on decision making. No, they absolutely can. But again, they have to be taught how to think. And that sounds kind of strange. They have to be taught how to think, but they actually do. Often, they learn it just by observing us, adults, right? So you observe your parents, whether you're conscious of it or not, either consciously or subconsciously, you are observing adults. You're observing your parents, you're observing your teachers, and how they make decisions, right? Again, in the context of like a family, we're around them all the time, so we're sort of just used to seeing how they do things, and that's part of it. That's social learning, called social learning, where we learn by emulating, we learn by listening and watching and all that, and we sort of soak it all in. Okay, and so we learn how they make decisions, and then we learn how to make decisions. So if young people are around adults that don't make good decisions, they make very bad decisions, they make very rash decisions, and so forth. Of course, they learn those ways. Does it mean that young people should not be held accountable for their actions? No, they should be. They have to learn to be. And that's part of their education, is that they have to learn that their actions have consequences. So if I drive down the highway at 180 kilometers per hour, number one, I could die. I could get seriously injured. I could injure somebody else. I could get arrested. So many things that could happen. They have to literally be taught a lot of these things, okay? Because surprisingly enough, it may not be enough for them to stop doing what they're doing, right? Even though they know all these things, they're still gonna do it, right? Because that impulse is just too strong, right? The thrill that they get, right? That feeling of invincibility they get when they go down the highway at 3 o'clock in the morning at 180 kilometers an hour, that's just too powerful, right? So they have to be reminded and sometimes even constrained and saying, look, you cannot go out. You know, maybe the parents have to I have to say, look, you cannot go out. It's too late. It's too dangerous for you to be doing these things. This could happen. This could happen. This could happen. So they have to be reminded of the consequences of what they're doing. Okay. So it's important that adults are aware of all these things. Okay? We have to be aware of these things. Right. So like when parents, I don't know, in Bahasa, I'm not sure what the word is, but in English we have this word called nagging, right? So parents like to nag their kids. You know, they're constantly reminding them to do things, and and a lot of teenagers, they get so annoyed with parents. Oh, you've told me that a million times. Stop reminding me. Stop telling me that, right? This is kind of like, but actually, that nagging is a very important part of this process. That constant reminding. Teenagers need a lot of constant reminding to sort of fight these impulses that they constantly have, right? And which makes it in some ways, which is often the source of that storm and stress that we talked about earlier in the class, right? That friction, that tension between parents and young people. Okay, so here's a chat. Here's a question here. Oh, bebel, it's the word. Oh, bebel is the word for nagging. Oh, thank you, Ania.
Yes.
I did not know that. Okay. So yeah, so even, I mean, like I said, I have teenage kids, and I find myself nagging them all the time, as is my wife, right? And then sometimes, as a youth, as a youth, as a scientist in youth development, I have to think back and sort of try to understand, why do we do that with young people? Why do we nag so much? Right? But this explains a lot of it. This explains actually why we have to keep nagging them. Okay, so we see this all the time, right, in the newspapers. So fatal car crashes are way more likely with teens behind the wheel, but is inexperience really to blame? Memory could have something to do with it. Okay, so this is some research done on, again, understanding the teenage brain, in this case, memory, right? So teenagers are apt to forget things easily, especially like things that, you know, again, why adults have to keep reminding them, right? So maybe it's because of the fact that they just don't have that kind of ability to remember the lessons that they're supposed to remember. So a lot of times we say it's because they're inexperienced, that's why they get into accidents. Well, that's probably not the only reason, right? I'm sure it has a lot to do with those other things that we just talked about. A tough early childhood stunts brain growth in adolescence. Okay, this is another. This is from a research study as well. So children, so people, young people who have difficult early childhoods. In other words, maybe they grow up in low income areas. Maybe there's problems in the family, etc. Okay, this can actually stunt their brain growth in adolescence. It can actually affect the way the brain develops when they become teenagers. Okay, so this is really interesting research. Okay, because it can explain a lot of their behavior. How vaping nicotine can affect the teenage brain. Okay, so this is why people are very concerned about things like smoking and vaping with teenagers. Again, focusing on the brain. Why the brain? Because this is an age where the brain is growing so much. Okay, brain development is so important in this at this time of life. And the last one, social isolation derails brain development in mice. Brain and behavior impairments observed in loner adolescent mice. This is very interesting. We always say teenagers have this need to be social, to be with their peers, to be socializing. Okay. Well, is that only because of their need to belong, their sense that they need to belong in groups, right? Have a group identity and so forth. Well, here they're even saying that it could have to do with brain development, all right? And even social isolation, right? In other words, spending too much time alone can actually affect teenagers' brain development, okay? Possibly. Okay, this is in mice, so we don't know. Had they done this research in humans? We don't know, okay? But in terms of mice, that's very interesting. Think about that in terms of the current pandemic. What could some of the implications of this research be in terms of the current pandemic we're facing? Can anybody tell me? If they found that social isolation can affect brain development in mice, think about all the social isolation going on right now because of the pandemic. Think about all the teenagers that are not able to engage in social activities. Does it raise any questions for anyone? Okay. So Nabila said they cannot socialize physically with their peers, only virtually. Yeah, exactly. So most of their socialization now is virtual. Is that the same as social isolation? Sorry, is that the same as physical socialization? Right? We don't really know. And that's the big question. And that's the concern for many people. We don't really know. Is virtual socialization, is it equally beneficial as physical socialization? Can it replace it, right? And what effects will it have on brain development? That's another one we don't really know. Okay, so Nabila also said, thus they will face some difficulties when they have to face other people in future social events. And that is very possible. That is very possible, right? So this whole situation we're in could have very detrimental effects on youth development, on teenage development, right? In relation to the brain, okay? If they're not getting those kind of social experiences that they're supposed to be getting for the brain to develop properly, okay? So we don't know. There's a lot of questions that the pandemic is raising along these lines. So thank you, Nabila. Very good answer. Okay, so physical growth. Physical growth influences behavior, okay? So irregular growth, you know what, actually, this is out of order. Ooh, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna go back to these. Okay, I'm gonna go back to those. That should be later in the presentation. Okay, we'll go back to those. All right, so mental and cognitive growth. So it refers to the development of the mind. Okay, so young people learning to solve problems, make judgments, deal with problems, deal with situations, deal with learning. Okay, so all these are mental or cognitive growth aspects. Okay, young people learning how to solve problems, like making judgments, dealing with their problems, dealing with situations, and dealing with learning. And so as we just mentioned, these are aspects of cognitive growth, and they are very important because many of them have to do with how young people get on in the world, right? Especially in terms of problem solving. And that's one of the reasons why now in education, you see so much emphasis on, like in universities, we're supposed to be teaching all you guys how to do problem solving and higher order thinking and all these things, because they recognize that this is the age where these things have to be learned as the brain is developing, right? And they say, actually, scientists say that the brain doesn't completely or fully develop until into the mid or late 20s, right? So mid or late 20s. So even you guys in your early 20s, your brains are still developing, right? So that's important to know. Okay, emotional growth in the age of youth, during the youth age, there's also feelings and emotions that you are experiencing that are affiliated with this age of development. Okay, so you have to learn how to deal with love. It's a reality. Young people fall in love. Okay, cannot hide it. How to deal with hate. Right? I hate her. She said this about me. She did that about me, behind my back, etc., etc. How do you deal with these very strong emotions? Okay, and this is the age when when people first start to have these emotions, these strong feelings, is in the teenage years. Dealing with joy, okay, dealing with fear for the first time, real fear. Dealing with excitement in other similar situations. right? So this is all part of emotional growth, learning how to deal with all these emotions, very powerful emotions. Okay? It's quite common actually. So I, as many of you may know or may not know, I am a convert to Islam. I converted to Islam when I was 27 years old. Okay, but it's quite common for a lot of young people, especially in like Western countries where it's more common for people to convert, change their religions, that a lot of young people in their late teens often will convert to other religions. Okay, and that's also, we can understand that also developmentally. There's a developmental reason for that. Okay, we're going to get to that in a minute. Okay, social growth. Young people undergo a lot of growth socially. Okay, so they have to learn to manage relationships and interactions with parents, siblings, schools, community, peers, okay, and other adults, other types of adults that they may come in contact with, right? So this is an age where young people are learning what it means to be social. Right? And again, nowadays, this is not only physically, this is also virtually. How to socialize in a manner that is appropriate according to the norms of the society that you're in, right? And so this is a very critical age for social growth, right? And that, of course, that relates back to what we mentioned before about what's going on now during the pandemic and how is it affecting young people's social growth. We don't really know, and we won't know for a while, right? We won't really know because these things, first of all, it's still going on. It's very new, right? And to do the kind of research we need to do, it takes time. It takes time. So this is a big question mark for everybody. What's happening to young people in terms of social growth? Okay, so let's now break it up a little bit between what we have early. If we look at the youth age, right? Let's just use Malaysia as an example, 15 to 30. Okay, so typically as researchers, we tend to break up the youth period according to three sort of phases: early youth, what we call middle youth, and then we call late youth. Okay, so early youth is pretty much the teenage years, so 15 to 20, 15 to 19, something like that. All right. Oops. That's so the teenage years are pretty much considered the early youth years, and then we have the middle youth, which is like you guys, from like 21 to 25 or 20 to 25, around that period. So when you're in university, and then right after university, when you start to enter into the world of work and so forth, that's sort of middle youth. And then we have the late youth, and the late youth is those that are sort of beginning their careers, starting to think about family and so forth. Okay, so let's sort of let's break this down a little bit and look at this a little more closely. So in terms of physical development, early youth, as we've sort of mentioned already, growth spurts. Okay, so young people just growing very fast, especially in the teenage years. All right, in terms of weight and height. Okay, females develop faster than males. I don't know if you guys realize that or know that, but females tend to develop faster than males. And that's also true cognitively as well. The brain, female brains develop faster than males. And this is one of the reasons, this is one of the arguments actually for why many people feel that young, at this age, especially in these early adolescent, teenage years, many people feel that boys and girls should not be educated together, okay, that they should have separate education because of the fact that they don't develop at the same rate, right? So people always complain and say, oh, why are the boys so immature, right, compared to the girls? Well, that's mostly because females develop faster physically, okay? And so they appear to be more mature, right? So that's one argument for why some people say boys and girls should not be educated together. In other words, at the same time, like mixed classes and so forth, because it's not fair. They're actually at different phases of development, right? And so that's one, you'll hear that argument sometimes. And it's a fair argument because it used to be the case where in many cultures, they were not educated together, right? And it's sort of the modern influence, Western influence on the rest of the world that has sort of made it sort of a mandatory principle that boys and girls should be educated together all the time and so forth. But there are strong biological arguments against that, physiological arguments against that. Okay. So weight gain. So at this age, females tend to gain more fat. Boys or males tend to gain more muscle, right? You see this in teenagers. Okay, and maybe some of you girls out there were complaining when you were at this age, right? And the boys were getting big muscles. Okay, internal organs grow, right? You get irregular growth patterns, often which causes awkward appearances and coordination problems. Okay, so sometimes you see these, especially usually in boys, you see them, maybe they grow very fast. They grow like 3 inches in 1 year, right? But then they look sort of awkward and they have a hard time sort of controlling their bodies, especially if they're playing sports. You know, and I played a lot of sports when I was young, and so I see this all the time in young people that play sports. They have a hard time sort of controlling their bodies because of the awkwardness, because the fact that their bodies are growing so fast. They have to learn all those motor skills. It's hard for them to adapt their motor skills, right? Of course, at this age, we also get development of the sexual organs, okay, and the secondary sexual characteristics. So all that part of the body is also growing, of course, along with the hormones that go with it, right? So you see puberty there at the age of baligh or puberty. We have the beginning of the sex hormones start to play a major role in the body and so forth. So in terms of physical development, you see there's a lot of changes going on in early youth, right? So again, those adolescent, teenage years, there's tremendous amount of physical change. Okay. Questions, comments? All right, we're gonna take a break in a few minutes just to get away from our screens for a few minutes. Okay, so let's just do one more. Okay, so in early youth, and we've already sort of talked about this a little bit on mental and cognitive development. So you have the physical changes going on. We also have the mental and cognitive changes going on. Okay, so young people are in school at this age. They're learning acquiring a lot of knowledge. They're gaining social skills, right? Language begins to develop more, right? So this is the age where all the slang starts to develop, right? So teenagers are actually coming up with their own, in some cases, their own languages, their own variations on language, right, at this age. Okay, and that again has to do with the development of the brain, also the socialization aspect, socializing with other groups of young people, creating these you know, having group identity. So you start to hang out with a certain group of young people. You share the same interests, right? So you develop a different language or a variation of language based on that. Okay, so like, you know, if you go online, you see all these interest groups like K-pop and all that. They have their own way of speaking, as many of you are well aware, you know, their own slang and so forth. The ability to internalize language at this age, because of the development of the brain, cognitive, they're more capable to internalize language and the meaning of language, right? So their understanding of language is deeper now, okay? Words now have more meaning. Concepts, they understand what a concept is. They understand what a principle is. They understand the meaning of words at a much deeper level, okay? So that's part of cognitive development. In their intellectual interests expand, okay, at this age. All right, so you see young people taking certain interest in different issues or different, you know, they develop hobbies and so forth based on intellectual interests. They learn how to make decisions for the first time, right? You know, so like if you look at students that go off to boarding school at the age of 11 or 12, right? Going out on their own, they have to learn how to make decisions. And this is the age where they begin to be able to do that. Prior to that, it was more or less they just follow what the parents tell them to do, right? They just sort of follow. Parents say, do this, they do this. Teachers say, do this, they do this, right? Now they begin to learn how to make their own decisions. Right? So they're actually capable of beginning to do that weighing between, you know, what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing, is this good for me, is this not? So they begin to develop that ability at this age, okay? And they can also accept responsibility for their actions, which is why discipline at this age is very important, okay? Discipline is very important. Why is it that at this age they can begin to accept responsibility? Can anybody guess? Based on everything we've just discussed, why at this age is it that they are able to accept responsibility for their actions? Just have to make sure you guys are all awake, that's all. Anyone? Early adolescence, the early youth period is a good age for development of discipline, all right? Why? In relation to accepting responsibility for actions. Who can guess? Anyone? No one? Maybe I need to open my, oh, sorry, there's a comment here. I missed this chat. Nabila said they feel obligated to be held accountable for their actions. They feel obligated. Why do they feel obligated at this age? Nabila. Nabila, you want to follow up with that? Why do you think they feel obligated? Not sure. Okay, that's fine. I appreciate your honesty. Okay. So if this is the age where they are able to begin to understand at a deeper level, for example, the consequences of their actions, then obviously it's an age where they can also be shaped and sort of molded in a way that they can understand that things are right and wrong, right? So if they're in an environment where parents and teachers and whoever are teaching them what is proper behavior, what's not proper behavior, this is right, this is wrong, they can internalize it at this age. So this is the age where the type of education has to be very intensive, right? So that's why discipline is emphasized at this age in the early adolescent years, because they can begin to understand why they're being disciplined, why they're being told not to do something, right? Whereas prior to that, when they're very small, they just do it because they're told to do it. But now they can begin to understand, okay, there's a reason why they're telling me not to do it. And that becomes then internalized, and they can accept it, accept responsibility for it, right? So again, they become more like adults, being more responsible for their actions, okay? At least in terms of capacity, they're capable to do that more so at this age, okay? So yes, it is the early stages of maturity. I mean, yes, they are learning how to be mature, right? But maturity is a word that can mean different things. So yes, it is a maturation process. It's a process of becoming more mature, right? And all of this is related to that, becoming more mature or becoming more like adults, right? Essentially, okay. All right, so that's the early years cognitive development. Okay, so I think it's 9 o'clock. I think we'll just let's take a short break, okay, just to get away from our screens. Just take five or 6 minutes. Okay?
Okay.
Belay? Okay. So we'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we will continue with the lecture. So there was a question from one of the students about the exam next week. Being in, Dwi Bahasa, meaning can students answer in both BM or Malay? BM or Malay, I mean BM or English. Okay, so yeah, the questions, I'll be presenting the questions in English, tapi you boleh jawab in BM, it's okay. If you need to, then that's no problem. Of course, most of the exam you won't have to really write. There's just going to be one or two questions maybe that you'll do some writing. Okay, so for those questions, yes, you may use BM.
Okay, Doctor.
All right, so no worries about that, inshallah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. The other thing is, you know, in the Zoom, in the chat box, there's the option to send questions privately. You know, so I know like maybe you're kind of hesitant to say things during the lecture, ask questions through the Zoom. I mean, in terms of, you know, speaking, but feel free to answer to send me questions privately through the chat box, okay? And I won't necessarily, you know, I don't have to. I'll keep your name private. I won't mention who asked the question. Okay, so if you're feeling, you know, maybe you're a bit shy to share questions with or ask questions, please feel free to use the chat box, okay? Because you can send questions privately. It doesn't have to be publicly for everyone to see, all right? I just want to make sure that everybody is clear about everything and there's no, you know, that you're not confused and feel free if you're having trouble following me, if you're not sure on maybe on something I said or it's not clear to you, please feel free to ask me to clarify, okay? I have no problem at all if people have to ask me to clarify anything that I've said, okay? So please don't feel any hesitancy to ask those kind of questions. All right. I'll keep my chat box open. Okay. All right, so let's continue with the early youth period. Okay, so emotional development. We did speak about earlier when we talked about the deficit theories. Remember, we talked about storm and stress. So yes, often emotionally there is this sort of storm and conflict that tends to come about with teenagers. They become very concerned about their appearance, as we all know. They respond more to their peers, right? So they become very close with the peers. And this may create some conflict with values. Okay, so, you know, oftentimes you get some conflict between teenagers and their parents, for example, because of values, you know, especially with families that tend to be more conservative in terms of their values, maybe religiously and stuff like that. And then teenagers who are exposed to a lot of modern ideas, a lot of Western ideas, perhaps, you know, it sometimes creates this clash, right? This clash in values, okay? So that's quite common in the early years, early youth, especially in the teenage years. For some young people, it may occur later, you know, depending on the culture also. So do you guys, would you agree with that, that this happens in Malaysia or no? You don't agree? This kind of clash of values? Yes, it does?
Yes.
Okay. So this is probably a kind of a universal thing. So we see this in many cultures. Okay, so that's emotionally. So socially, okay, this is the age where young people begin to move away from family, okay? Although in a lot of cultures it doesn't happen until later. But as like you guys, for example, moving off to university is the beginning of moving away from family, all right? So at around, you know, 18, 19, in many cultures is when youth start to move away from family. And they find security in their peers, right? Groups of people their own age, okay? Teenagers are known for this, right? And there's a reason for that. Social development, okay, is one reason, right? It's the age where they begin to learn how to socialize. And this is what we would consider to be a sort of common human characteristic. You know, human beings are social creatures. We are social creatures. We are born to be social, right? We have this innate, it's part of our fitrah, as we would say in Islam. It's part of our fitrah, our innate nature to socialize with others. Okay, so it's the age of early youth, teenagers, that this really begins to take off and become very important in their lives. All right. And then from that, they begin to develop more mature attitudes and patterns of behavior. Okay, again, moving towards that adulthood kind of thing, that way of living like adults, right? Becoming more like adults and less like children. right? So this is all in early youth, in the teenage years, before the age of, say, 18, 19, 20. Okay, now late youth, when we talk about later, the older youth, those in their 20s, late 20s and so forth, at the late youth period, this is when physical development is basically no longer really occurring, at least in major ways, right? So the physical development, the body and so forth, most of that has been pretty much completed. Okay, for women, this is when young women begin to bear children, right? And it's considered a prime childbearing time when they are the most fertile, right? And this is when male and female sexual development is also at its peak, right? In late youth. Okay, so that's important to know. And this is one of the reasons why this is the age of marriage in many cultures, right? In terms of mental development or cognitive development, okay, this one, of course, continues with additional education and training, okay? So this is the age when either you're in university or you're doing even post-university, postgraduate work, all right? Or you're on the job, you're learning on the job, you're doing training, etc. So in terms of education and training, this continues, of course, in late youth for many young people, right? This is when young people begin to cope with independence, right? So they move sort of away from the comfort of those close peer groups. They're away from family. Maybe they're beginning having their first job or beginning their career, and they are sort of learning to be independent, or at least much more independent. Okay, and this is the age for that. They begin to make career choices, right? So this is the age in late youth when young people start, what you guys are doing right now, making career choices. You're beginning that process of choosing where you're going to get that first job and what kind of line you want to go into, what kind of career you want to go into, etc. Okay, this is all part of mental and cognitive development because these are all decisions that have to be made, right? Decision making, right? Problem solving. This relates to all of that cognitive work that's being done. Okay, establishing a lifestyle. What kind of life do you want to lead? Those kind of decisions. I mean, these are things that actually happen, even though we're not maybe aware of them, that they're happening, but they are. This is a form of development. It's a form of youth development, right? Where we begin to lay down our patterns and our lifestyles, right? What kind of lives do we want to live? Okay, and then of course selecting a partner for those that choose to get married at this age, and then starting a family. So a lot of this occurs in late youth, right? And that regardless of whether late youth is considered to be mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s, it's all sort of in that same kind of developmental period where all of this begins to happen, okay? So these are the changes that occur. In terms of emotional development in late youth, this is where stress starts to really hit, okay? Stress from family life, okay, and career, all right? So it's a different kind of stress than what you experience at, say, at university, right? Where you're stressed out mostly about your work, right? Your schoolwork and assignments and so forth. This is a different kind of stress. This is a new kind of stress for young people, right? The stress of family life and career. So I have a graduate student he's young, he's still young, he's probably around 30 years old, okay, a young person, just got married, right? And sometimes he comes to me and we discuss about his research, his PhD research, but then he'll also share with me some of his life stresses that he's experiencing, being a newlywed, having a young baby, right? He doesn't have much income, right? So you can see all the different stresses sort of coming into his life, right? And this tends to happen in late youth. If we think about our current situation with the pandemic, okay, again, making life for this particular group very difficult, right? So where there was already stress, now there's even more stress. More stress. And this is, we know this, there have been some studies that have already shown that things like domestic violence are on the rise during the pandemic. Do you guys know what domestic violence is? What is domestic violence? Can anybody tell me?
It's like the abused children get in their own house.
Yes, thanks, Fatim. It's not just children, though. It's also spouses as well, right? So you have cases where the husbands will physically hit or abuse the wives, and sometimes even, in fact, there was an article the other day showing that even in some cases, I think 30 out of, recently there were about 220 cases on domestic violence brought to whichever ministry, I can't remember which one, and 30 of them were actually wives abusing husbands. And so it's not only husbands abusing wives, right? And so that can be both physical abuse or hitting, you know, or some kind of physical abuse, violence, right? Physical violence. It can also be verbal abuse, right? Where they are just verbally putting down and saying very bad things to each other. It can be psychological abuse. Psychological, you can abuse people psychologically, right? You can harass them psychologically. So there's many different types of abuse. So during the pandemic, we have much higher rates of this kind of thing. And this is globally, we know this, we see this happening. What are the obvious reasons for that? Why is domestic violence on the rise during the pandemic?
The stress,
Okay, stress from what?
the pressure, financial constraints, like, you know, because domestic violence is violence committed by someone in the victim's domestic circle. So it's more like they spend a lot of time together. And when that happens, if something occur, like the problems arises, so they don't know how to, instead of just telling the problems to their spouse or anyone's near them, so they started to use their power or their words to abuse someone just to make them feel better, just to feel more powerful.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's absolutely true. There's a lot of reasons. I think stress is definitely one, financial stress, right? So husbands that feel responsible for their family, you know, suddenly they lose their jobs, right? Or they have their wages cut or whatever, and they feel this this immense stress of not being able to provide for their families. And on top of that, there's less jobs out there for them to find, and they can't even leave their houses or at least their areas in many situations. So they feel this real sense of constraint and helplessness, you know, and I mean, and then, you know, and this is also true for women as well. I'm not just saying it's just men, but it's also true for women. But I think in many cases where the men are abusing wives, I think it's definitely that combination of frustration and stress. And like you said, Hanim, sometimes they internalize that, and they feel so powerless that they take it out on, you know, those that are closest to them. And so, yeah, so sometimes it does get sort of, I think, transformed into this power thing where they're just, you know, expressing their power. But I think it's a legitimately, we have to look at the stress, all the different stresses that they're facing as a big contributing factor to that. So yeah, very good. And then, oh yeah, of course, children are also they're easy victims because they're powerless, right? They're powerless, and it's easy to take out frustrations on those who are powerless. And then, like you said, they're in our homes. What's really interesting is, you know, you have so many families that are living in like very small houses or apartments or flats, you know, with so many people. They have very big families. So you can imagine the amount of stress that they're facing in a pandemic, in a lockdown MCO, right? They cannot really go out, they cannot work, they cannot, you know, and then they're in such close contact with each other all the time, you know. So it creates a very, very unhealthy situation. You know, and then you have teenagers on top of it who are going through all these, as we've just been discussing, they're going through all these changes, right? And they're all this impulse and so forth. It must be a really difficult situation. You can only imagine, yeah. So we can see why. We can clearly see why. I think why domestic violence would be on the rise during a pandemic, and why it is on the rise in so many countries, so many countries. Okay, so can we move on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about spiritual development. Spiritual development is another part another aspect or dimension of adolescent development. And a lot of times people confuse spiritual development with religion or religiosity specifically, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with religion or religiosity. It's the sort of the urge to grow spiritually. Now, of course, if I'm a Muslim, that usually means I will manifest my spiritual development from within the context of my religion, Islam. Or if you're a Christian, or if you're a Buddhist, or whatever, you manifest that spirituality or that spiritual development through your religion. Okay, but spiritual development, we can confidently say, is a universal characteristic. Okay, and this has been documented in many scientific studies as well. Okay, so it is a normal process, it's a natural process, it's a universal process. Okay, and it's necessary. You know, of course, there are people out there that don't believe that that human beings have a spiritual side to them, right? So they might disagree. The vast majority of people on the planet, in fact, and they've done studies on this even, do acknowledge that there is something called spirituality, human spirituality, right? And so for most people, this is a natural, normal, and universal thing, and it's a very important aspect of our development, right? Very important aspect. It is, of course, related. Now, spirituality and spiritual development is, of course, related to cognitive development. It's even related to physical development, okay? As our intellectual interests expand, we have increasing thoughts of the future, right? We have increasing ability to think abstractly, conceptually, an increased sense of self. All of that is related to spiritual development, okay? It's also related to our understanding of our own, for example, religious backgrounds, our religious faith, our tradition. It's our ability to understand our own religion grows as well during this period because of the ability of the intellect to more deeply, more thoroughly process information, derive meaning from things, right? So for example, you have students in Tafiz schools at very young ages. They're just memorizing, right? Memorizing the Quran, for example. They memorize, but they're not really yet understanding it, right? And that's okay. That's because what that is actually by memorizing at that very young age, they're building on their strengths at that age. So children at a very young age have an incredible ability to memorize. They're like, we say they're like sponges, right? They can take in so much information and just regurgitate it so easily. That is the age where you want young children to memorize things, right? And that's why kids memorize things through songs, through poetry, right? They like to sing, a lot of the different things that they memorize in school. They do it through songs and stuff like that. They have that ability to memorize. But once they begin to get into adolescence, teenagers, young people, youth, then the brain starts to develop, the intellect starts to develop, and they're able to think more deeply and more meaningfully about these things. And this is the age where they begin to study things like tafsir of the Quran. Okay, and I'm using the Islamic tradition as an example. Okay, so they're able to use this. So they're able to think more deeply and understand those things more richly, right, at that age. Okay, so it's very much related to intellectual and cognitive development. Even the notion of the self, they can understand that they have a self, right? The sense of self that only develops once they hit adolescence and teenage. Before that, they don't really, the concept of the self is very strange to them. They don't really understand it. That's why little kids always refer to themselves by their first name, at least in the old days. Nadia Sukani, Nadia Suka, that my daughter Nadia. Nadia Sukani, Nadia. She's only 5 years old, so she refers to herself as Nadia. She doesn't say saya, all right, or aku. She says Nadia. Once they become teenagers, then suddenly it's saya. That sense of self, that who I am, begins to develop. And this is related very much to spiritual development, because central to the task of identity development, right, is this idea of a spiritual consciousness. Who am I? What am I? What am I doing here? Why am I here? All these big questions. This is the age where teenagers, young people start to ask these bigger questions, right? They begin to locate themselves within something greater than themselves. right? They realize that they are just part of a bigger universe, right? Again, that is a spiritual consciousness. In other words, they are realizing, they're beginning to realize, right, that they are something very small in a bigger universe. Okay. Now, again, how they understand that specifically is going to be through their own religious tradition most times, right? So, as a Muslim, I will understand and explain that through my religious teachings. But that sense of self, that sense of who I am, what I am, even those questions that we ask, is universal for all people, right? And we know this from studies that at this age, this tends to be a universal kind of experience for people, right? And this begins to generate that sense of meaning, order. They try to understand their place in the world, right? They try to more deeply understand those bigger questions, right? What am I doing here? Why was I created? What is my purpose in life? What should I be doing with my life? Who am I? Right? Those are all we call them identity questions about who you are, your identity formation, but they're also very much spiritual questions. Okay? Because it is connected to things like the supernatural, being human, what does it mean to be human, the natural order of things, okay? These are all very much interrelated, okay? And so this is what we would refer to as spiritual consciousness. And then that, of course, relates to our religious rituals and practices, okay? So as our consciousness grows, we begin to engage more in religious rituals and practices, okay? Of course, not everybody. This is not to say that everybody does, but a lot of people do, most people do. At least in this culture, in other cultures, they engage in rituals differently, okay? Maybe not to the extent that other cultures do, of course. It depends on the specific culture, okay? But this is the age, the point is that this is the age where a lot of these rituals and practices, they begin to take on more meaning, right? And a lot of young people begin to ask why, like in our religion, in the religion of Islam, a lot of young people at this age will ask, well, why do I have to pray 5 times a day? Why do I have to fast? They start to ask those questions. Why do I have to do it? Why do I do it? Why are we commanded to do these things? Why are we told and taught to do these things, right? Maybe as a Christian, why do I have to go to church on Sunday? I grew up Christian, so I used to ask those questions myself, right? So this is the age where rituals and practices begin to take on new meaning, right, and new importance. And young people even begin to question them. Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do this? That is not necessary, and a lot of our parents and maybe ustads and teachers, they say, don't ask those questions. You shouldn't be asking those questions. It's haram to ask those questions. Of course, one would argue that that's not necessarily true. It's important to ask questions, and those are important questions to ask. You must know why you're doing what you're doing, right? Especially if you have this urge to really better understand, what is the role of religion in your life? What is the role of these practices in developing your spirituality and being able to answer these big questions? You have to understand. You have to know the answers to those questions. When I was learning about Islam, when I was a Christian and I became a Muslim. These are a lot of the questions that I was asking myself. First, I asked them as a Christian. I would ask myself these questions. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Why do we believe this? Why do we believe that? Right? And then after that, and from my exposure to Islam after that, I started asking the same questions about Islam. Right? And it was because of that questioning and the answers that I was getting from the people I was asking. It was those answers that I was getting and those answers that spoke to me, right? They spoke to my desire to know, my desire to understand these things, these kind of spiritual questions. That is sort of what led me to change my faith, okay? So, and it's very common. You see, if you read any stories about religious conversion, it often happens at this age, in youth, because this is the age where young people are beginning to become more aware of themselves and this idea of a spirituality. Stewardship of the environment. The environment as a spiritual consciousness, as part of spiritual consciousness. Very interesting, okay? But it is, and for many people, issues of the environment are very spiritual, almost religious in their importance, right? And we see this, especially nowadays, you see all these environmental movements where people are very passionate about it, right? It's almost like it's their religion, you know. But there are people that really do see our role as stewards or as people that are supposed to be taking care of the physical environment. They see it as as a religious responsibility, right? So you see many people, but it does also reflect this idea that there's a bigger world out there, and we're just, you know, we're just one part of that bigger world, right? And so this becomes part of their spiritual consciousness. Any questions about anything I just shared? Does any of this ring familiar to you guys? Maybe have you experienced a lot of these same things?
Mm, not really, but sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, of course it's different for everyone. Of course it's different for everyone. And at what stage in your life you begin to ask those kind of questions, of course that's different for everybody. You know, just wondering if anybody has had these kinds of experiences. No one wants to share? Okay. All right, so what are the implications of that? Well, research has shown actually that these the implications of spirituality on youth development are actually quite dramatic. Having a strong sense of spirituality, all right, has been shown to be what's called a protective factor against a variety of risk behaviors. Okay, substance abuse, like drugs, delinquency, violence, early onset of sexual activity. Okay. So young people that have a strong sense of spirituality tend to be less likely to engage in these types of behaviors. Okay, that's what research has shown. Okay, so which is typically why I think in our Malaysian culture, people always sort of relate, you know, this idea that, well, if young people are more religious, they'll be less likely to do those things, right? Those risk behaviors, right? But research does show that it's true. There are strong relationships between having a strong sense of spirituality and being less engaged in risk behavior. Okay, so there is also scientific evidence that this is the case. All right? And that's one of the reasons why I think people try to promote religion and spirituality among youth, right? Is to help them to have that strong grounding, strong perspective, right? To keep them away from these types of behaviors. Research also shows that strong spirituality is also promotive. In other words, it promotes positive behaviors like academic competence, being able to cope with stress, meaning and purpose, having a sense of meaning and purpose in life, having pro-social values, which is like values that are like being kind to other people, being charitable, helping out, okay, the pro-social values. And then being caring, being involved in volunteer service and stuff like that. So those who tend to be more, have that higher sense of spirituality, maybe more religious, they tend to be more, have more of these positive outcomes as well. Okay, positive outcomes. So this is based on research that's been done not just here, but in other countries as well. This is sort of universal research. All right. So one of the very interesting things here is coping with stress, right? Looking at the situation now, and we know that there's a lot of stress because of the pandemic. So it would be very interesting to see what role spirituality is playing among young people now in terms of helping them to cope with stress. I don't know if you guys have any experience with that, but is your being religious, practicing religion, having a strong sense of spirituality, does it help you cope with the situation now? Does anyone like to share? Does it give you a stronger perspective, a better perspective? Does it ground you? Does it help you stay positive? What do you guys think?
Be positive.
It helps you to stay positive.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? No one else wants to share? Okay. Okay. I think I'm going to actually stop there. It's already 9:40. And so I'm going to stop here. So in terms of the exam next week, I won't go beyond this slide. Okay, this point here on spirituality. Okay. Again, I don't want to say I'm concerned, but I'm a little bit, I'm getting very little feedback from all of you. So I just hope everything is clear. And I hope that there's not too many questions. And if there are, please, really, I strongly encourage you to ask me any questions, anything you're not clear about. Okay. It's very important to make sure your questions are answered. All right. So anything else before we break? So I know you guys have another class soon, so I'll stop there.
Doctor.
Yeah.
So today's lessons, maksudnya apa yang hari ni
Yeah.
masuk exam lah.
Yes, but only up until this point, not the full slide, not the full set of slides. Only up until this point, up until this slide. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So anything up until this slide is fair game for the exam next week. All right. Okay. If there's nothing else, then I will, inshallah, see you guys tomorrow. 12 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Doctor.
All right. Thank you. Inshallah, jumpa lagi.
Thank you,
Thank you, Doctor.
Assalamualaikum. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Doctor.